This was a night that belonged to the storm, a symphony of howling wind and blinding, endless snow, and a silence so profound it could shatter a person's spirit. But then a knock. On her threshold stood a stranger, a ghost of ice cradling 2 newborn pups to his heart. She couldn't have known that opening her door meant awakening a hidden past, a history steeped in anguish, and unlocking a miracle destined to change their lives forever. Before this story unfolds, let us know where you're joining us from. And if you feel a connection to this tale, please subscribe for more stories like it. The wind screamed across the frozen expanse of Wyoming, a feral beast clawing at the shutters of the old ranch house, desperate to get in from the dark. Snow fell in a blinding, relentless curtain, burying fences, trees, and even memory. Inside, Abby Monroe found warmth beside the wood stove, her shawl pulled tight over a nightgown worn thin by the passage of too many winters. At 31, she moved with a quiet resilience, a woman forged by loss but never shattered by it. Her chestnut brown hair, bound loosely at the nape of her neck, captured the firelight in threads of auburn. Solitude had etched a deep gentleness into her face, but also an unwavering watchfulness. Her brown eyes, while soft, saw everything. She tilted the kettle, letting the warm steam kiss her cheek. She shouldn't have been awake so late, but the night held a tension she had learned to respect. The very air felt like it was holding its breath. And then it happened. 3 solid knocks, not a gentle rap, but the desperate pounding of a person with nowhere else to turn. Abby went still, her hand frozen over the kettle, her heart leaping into her throat. No one ever came out this far after dark. Her closest neighbor was 5 miles north, and even he wouldn't dare a storm like this one. She whispered into the silence. No one rides after dark. Her words a fragile tremor in the vast emptiness of the house. Instinct took over, moving her body before her thoughts could form. She reached behind the heavy coats, her hand finding the cold steel of her father's shotgun. The man who taught her that preparedness was survival and mercy was a luxury you couldn't always afford. Her father had been gone 2 winters now. Her mother, her spirit weary, had followed him shortly after. Silence had become Abby's only companion, that silence and the steady beat of survival. The knocking returned, more forceful now, rattling the very latch. "Ma'am?" A voice torn and raw from the wind cut through the gale. "I don't mean you any harm. I just need shelter. They're not going to make it." The word "they" caught in her mind. She paused, then slowly slid the bolt, easing the heavy door open just a crack. The storm forced its way in a surge of freezing mist and snow spilling onto the floorboards. From the swirling white, a figure emerged. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a military-style parka, lined with ice, his beard caked with snow. His hair was cut short, a deep brown, his jawline traced with the faint memory of old scars. His eyes were a steely gray, too calm for the situation, a stillness born from staring down danger one too many times. He clutched a bundle to his chest, a rough wool blanket soaked by the storm. "Please," he rasped, his voice a low whisper shredded by the wind. "They're freezing to death." Abby raised the lantern, its light falling upon the shifting shapes within the blanket. 2 tiny German shepherd puppies, barely a few days old, their small bodies trembling, their fur cold and damp. One was black and tan, the other a pale golden cream. Their faint whimpers were almost lost to the wind, their noses pressed tight for warmth. Her heart seized. But when Abby spoke, her voice was firm. "The barn's out back. There's dry straw in the corner. It should keep you sheltered till morning." The man simply nodded, the fight gone from his eyes. A flicker of profound gratitude crossed his weary features. "Thank you, ma'am." He breathed his words, turning to mist in the bitter air. "We'll be out of your way by dawn." She stood frozen, watching him trudge back into the tempest, his lantern a fragile glow swallowed by the swirling white. The door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back in felt heavy wrong. An unsettling quiet that stretched for minutes or maybe hours. Abby sat at her kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug warming her cold hands. 2 long winters she'd endured alone since her father's passing. She'd counted feed sacks and fence staples like rosary beads. This quiet had once been her fortress, a shield against the world. Then it became a penance, but tonight it felt like she was waiting. Outside the storm howled, and under its fury a tiny cry pierced the night. It was faint, muffled, a sound woven into the gale like a desperate prayer. In a single motion, Abby was on her feet. Her mug clattered against the tabletop. She grabbed her lantern, wrestled on her boots, and plunged head-first into the blizzard. The cold struck her like a physical blow, the wind clawing at her shawl. Snowdrifts clawed at her knees before she finally reached the barn. The door groaned open, revealing a lonely circle of lantern light. Against the far wall, the man was a silhouette, his parka a shield for the 2 tiny pups. He rocked gently, a human cradle against the storm. His breath came in shallow puffs, his lips drained of color by the biting cold, and yet his hands never faltered, a steadfast shelter for the fragile lives within. When he looked up, his eyes held surprise, but not an ounce of fear. It was something closer to an apology. Abby moved toward him. "Give them to me," she said, her voice soft but sure. He hesitated. They can last till morning, ma'am," he whispered. "Not if you don't." Her voice cut through the howling wind, impossibly calm, unyielding. She held out her arms. He searched her face for a long moment, then surrendered the precious bundle into her hands as if it were a holy relic. The puppies stirred feebly, one letting out the softest sigh. Without a word, Abby turned and nodded toward the warmth of the house. "Come on." The moment they crossed the threshold, the warmth of the cabin enveloped them like a blanket. She laid the pups on a folded quilt by the hearth and began to gently rub their tiny bodies dry. The man lingered awkwardly by the door. Melted snow dripped from his coat, pooling on the floorboards. Up close, the exhaustion was etched into every line of his face. His parka was ripped at the sleeve. His boots were split at the seams, yet beneath the travel-stained grime he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. A straight spine, a quiet discipline, and eyes that held the ghosts of things seen. "Sit," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the pups. "You're making a puddle on the floor." He obeyed without a word, sinking onto the rug beside the hearth. For a long moment, they both just watched the flames dance. The puppies, now dry and swaddled in wool, began to breathe with a steady, peaceful rhythm. The man let out a lung-shuddering breath, his shoulders finally slumping. "The name's Ethan Cole," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was Navy." Abby's eyes met his for a second, seeing the deep weariness there. "Used to be," she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a slight nod, as if that simple phrase explained everything. They fell into a comfortable silence, letting the fire speak for them. It crackled and popped a warm counterpoint to the snow, whispering against the glass. Abby returned to her seat at the table. Her gaze fell upon the sleeping man, and the 2 fragile lives nestled beside him. For years this house had held only her own quiet solitude. Tonight it held another heartbeat, a presence that was not her own. She watched as Ethan finally drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. With one hand still resting protectively on the blanket, Abby knew that for the first time in ages she was not utterly and completely alone. The morning emerged, pale and silent, the world outside buried beneath a pristine, sound-absorbing hush of white. Heavy ridges of snow strained the roof, and the sky was a featureless haze of light. Abby Monroe was at the stove once more, her sleeves rolled high, the shawl replaced by a thick flannel shirt. A soft whistle from the kettle mingled with the faint aroma of coffee. The surreal events of the night clung to the air like smoke, a mixture of disbelief and a quiet awareness that the profound emptiness of her home had finally receded. She heard the crunch of boots on the porch just before he appeared. The steps were firm, rhythmic, and deliberate. Ethan Cole had risen long before the sun. By the time she opened the door, he was already clearing a path on the steps, heaving packed snow aside with an old shovel he had discovered by the shed. His parka was open to the biting cold, his sleeves rolled up his breath, pluming in the air. The gray dawn caught on the short, dark stubble shadowing his jaw. His every motion was controlled, efficient, revealing. A man long accustomed to working before the rest of the world began to stir. He gave her a brief, polite, but distant nod when he saw her. Figured you didn't need the porch to be frozen solid. His voice was hoarse, a low rumble stripped of the sharp edge it held during the storm. Abby watched him for a beat. He carried himself with a soldier's discipline, his back straight, even in exhaustion. Every gesture was pared down to pure purpose. His eyes seemed clearer than they were the night before, though a deep weariness still haunted them. There was an order to him that warred with the image of a broken drifter. A man like him once belonged to structure, to precision, to command. She held the door open for him to come inside. The scent of fresh coffee and burning wood enveloped him. On a folded quilt beside the fire, the two tiny pups slept, their fur now dry and shimmering gold in the new day's light. One of them stirred, letting out a faint yawn that was more of a soft squeak. Ethan crouched down beside them, the hard lines of his face softening in a way Abby hadn't witnessed in years. "They'll pull through," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure they would, but they're true fighters." "You knew what to do," Abby replied. "Warm milk, small amounts. I did that for a calf last spring. He made it." Ethan nodded, absorbing the information as if filing it away for future use. He reached out a hand, letting one minuscule paw come to rest on his finger. The pup's tiny claws snagged his skin, and a shadow of memory crossed his eyes. He spoke no more, but Abby could see in his stillness the immense weight of a man who had lost far more than he would ever say. She placed a steaming mug on the table before him and said, "You look like you could really use this." He let out a quiet, dry chuckle. "I've definitely had worse mornings." He took a drink, then stood his gaze sweeping the small cabin with a tactical assessment. "You keep things tidy," he remarked. "My father built it that way," Abby answered. "He liked everything squared away and secure before the first snow. He used to say, 'Chaos has no place indoors.'" Her voice wavered on the final word, and she quickly turned to the stove before he could see. Ethan noticed, of course, but he didn't press. He was a man who could recognize the shape of a wound without needing a confession. After their meal, he insisted on getting to work. Abby's protests were futile. He'd already located the axe by the back door. Through the window, she watched him split and stack the firewood with the same focused precision she had seen in his hands as he tended to the pups. The steady sound of an axe echoed through the frozen stillness. He worked with a deliberate grace, never wasting a single motion. His coat hung open, the scar along his jaw catching the pale morning light. She found herself wondering how long he had been adrift, how many brutal storms like this one his spirit had already endured. By noon, a week's worth of wood was stacked. When he came inside, his beard was laced with frost. His cheeks flushed a deep red from the biting cold. He poured a tin cup of water and stood by the fire, chafing the life back into his hands. At the feeling of warmth, the pups stirred and stumbled clumsily toward him, their little tails giving their very first frantic wags. A smile broke across his face, transforming it completely, softening the hard angles and revealing a vulnerable soul beneath. "Reckon we ought to name 'em before they start thinking we don't care," he said softly. Abby hesitated. Years had passed since she'd named anything she was afraid to lose. "Shadow," she said finally, pointing to the darker one. "He's quiet, but he's steady. And Scout for the other. He's the one full of curiosity." Ethan repeated the names, tasting them, as if they were more than simple labels. "Shadow and Scout," he murmured, giving a slow nod. "They'll do." The next day bled into the one that followed. Ethan asked if he could stay on until the roads were clear. Abby agreed, justifying to herself it was a fair trade. His help with long-neglected repairs in exchange for shelter and hot meals. He took the small storage room off the barn, fixing its broken door hinge before the first night even settled. By the second morning, the sounds of his boots and his tools had become the new heartbeat of the ranch. He patched the hole in the barn roof where snow bled in. He replaced a splintered rail on the corral, and he fixed the very pump handle she had long ago given up on. Abby would catch herself listening for the sounds of him during the quiet hours. The rasp of a saw, the crunch of snow, the deep timbre of his voice speaking softly to the dogs. The puppies flourished under his gentle care. They followed him like small, devoted shadows tumbling clumsily through the snowdrifts, their coats growing thicker, their bellies remaining full. Scout was the braver of the two, the first to lunge toward any new movement, while Shadow chose to remain close, his gaze always fixed on Ethan's boots. When the sun bled away, he would carry them both inside, setting them down gently near the hearth. Abby often watched from the table, feigning to read while she saw the quiet tenderness in his hands. In those days, the very atmosphere inside the house began to change. The silence, once a crushing weight, now felt like a long-held breath finally being released. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of coffee each morning, and the faint scent of oil and leather clung to the air in the evenings when Ethan came in from the barn. Abby spoke more than she had in years, not in a flood, but just enough to startle herself. She told him about the ranch, about how her father would whistle to the horses, and how her mother stitched quilts from the fabric of old worn work shirts. Ethan listened, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his face a mask of neutrality, but his attention unwavering. When he spoke, it was almost never of himself. She learned of his life only in fragments, that he'd given 15 years to the Navy, that he'd lost men he was responsible for, that the phantom sound of helicopters still shattered his sleep. His words were few, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. On the 5th day, a watery sun finally fought its way through the clouds. The storm had broken, leaving the entire landscape glazed in a coat of hard, brilliant silver. Ethan stood by the fence, Shadow and Scout wrestling around his boots, both yipping with a fierce, untamed pride. Abby walked over to stand beside him, burying her hands deep in her coat pockets. The mountains cut a merciless, clean line against the sky. "It'll thaw soon," she offered. "That road might just be clear by next week." Ethan acknowledged her words with a nod, his gaze fixed on the empty fields. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice hollow, with a quiet uncertainty, the sound of a man who'd lost faith that any road could lead to a better place. That evening, without a conscious thought, Abby set an extra place at the table. When Ethan sat down, his eyes fell upon it, but he held his silence. They ate to the gentle sounds of silverware and the crackle of the hearth. Shadow and Scout slept by their boots, their paws twitching in silent dreams. After the meal, Ethan turned his hands to fixing the broken window latch, then stood before the fire, unconsciously rubbing a deep ache in his shoulder. When she asked if it pained him, a faint smile touched his lips, his eyes lost in the flames. "None. The cold just gets down to the bone," he deflected. "That's all." But she saw a deeper chill in him. Before turning in for the night, Abby stepped out into the frigid air. The moon had returned, a silver shard in the sky, washing the world in a clean white light, as if it could erase every scar. Through the glass, she saw Ethan stretched out on the rug by the fire, the dogs curled tightly against him. His breath was deep and steady, one hand resting gently on the smaller pup's flank. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the quiet little house felt like a home. She lifted her face to the stars, a whisper escaping her lips, half prayer, half dawning truth. Sometimes the greatest warmth finds you disguised as trouble. By the second week of his stay, the snow was surrendering, melting in dark ribbons along the road, uncovering the rich, dark earth below. The air still held its bite, but a hesitant sunlight began to fracture the endless gray. A quiet rhythm began to define life on the Monroe Ranch. Ethan's days were filled with the steady chop of an axe splitting logs or the careful work of mending fences. Abby moved with purpose, tending her animals, while Shadow and Scout trotted between them, two small living embers of warmth and loyalty. and in the shared silence of their labor, an unspoken understanding began to take root, something fragile that neither dared to name. But they both felt it like the first delicate thaw deep beneath the winter frost. Yet Abby knew that peace in the cold of spring was a fragile, fleeting thing. The town lay 15 miles to the east, a mere scattering of wooden storefronts and peeling paint lining a single frozen main street. It was the sort of town where everyone knew your horse by sight, and a stranger's name became a whispered story before the sun went down. And by Thursday, a new story was making the rounds passed in low tones at the barber shop and the general store. The tale of the widow Monroe, who'd given shelter to a wanderer, a soldier, a man whose past was etched in conflict. Some claimed loneliness had finally softened her resolve, while others whispered of darker possibilities, the kind that fester when idle gossip finds fuel in the long winter boredom. That very day at noon, the groan of a wagon broke the silence, creaking up the snowy lane to Abby's ranch. At the reins sat Ethel Sanderson, Abby's closest neighbor and most steadfast friend, though closest still meant 5 hard miles of frozen earth. Ethel was in her 60s, a woman of small frame but formidable spirit, bundled in layers of brown wool and a thick green knit scarf. Her face was a map, etched not by vanity, but by years of relentless wind and deep-seated worry. Her pale blue eyes were sharp as morning frost, her mouth caught between a frown and a smile. Ethel had stood by Abby since she was a child, through the shattering loss of her parents, through every solitary, back-breaking harvest. And while her words could cut like winter wind, her heart was fiercely loyal. Abby met her on the porch, brushing the fresh snow from her gloves. "You've got more courage than sense, Ethel," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "These roads are nothing but mud." Ethel climbed down, her movements stiff with cold, and fixed her with a look that was a tangled knot of affection and deep suspicion. "Bravery," she said pointedly. "Is that what you're calling it?" "More like foolishness. I came because this spring just won't behave." Ethel followed her through the door. Unraveling her scarf, she drew in a deep, appreciative breath. "Smells better than idle talk. Coffee." Abby poured 2 steaming mugs and waited. She braced herself for what was coming. Ethel took a deliberate sip, her eyes steady. "They're talking, Abby, about the man you've taken in, whispering he's some kind of wandering soldier, maybe on the run from his past. You know how they are. No facts, just words that turn to poison." Abby's knuckles went white around her cup. "Ethan is not what they say. He has done more in 2 weeks than most men here do in a full month. He's a good man." Ethel's eyes softened. "I believe you, honey, but this town won't. They fear what they can't understand. And a woman on her own with a man of his kind. Well, you know how that looks." Abby let out a sharp, joyless laugh. "Let them talk. Their whispers have followed me since the funeral. This is nothing new." Beyond the window, the steady, honest rhythm of Ethan's hammer rang out from the barn. The pups yipped a high, clear counterpoint to his labor. Ethel glanced toward the sound. Then her eyes found Abby's again. "He keeps to himself," she mused. "Like a man haunted by his own ghosts." Abby nodded slowly. "He's seen things. He doesn't speak of it, but he's kind. The dogs trust him, so do the horses." Ethel sighed, clutching her shawl. "That kindness can be a dangerous thing, dear, if you come to depend on it." They passed the afternoon together. Ethel doted on the dogs, trying to hide how much their affection had won her over. Before she departed, she touched Abby's arm. "You're young enough to start over, dear. Don't let a man's troubles become your own heavy burden." Abby offered a faint smile. "I will remember that." After Ethel's wagon was swallowed by the white road, Abby remained on the porch, watching the trail vanish. The words lingered heavier than she wanted to admit. Inside, the kettle whistled sharply, and the hammering fell silent. She turned, seeing Ethan at the yard's edge, sleeves rolled high, his breath a white plume in the crisp air. He'd built a new pen for the calves, its lines perfectly straight and true. Shadow sat faithfully at his feet, as Scout joyfully wrestled a lost glove in the snow. "You have been busy," she said as he came inside, stamping the cold from his boots. "Kept my hands from freezing," he replied, removing his gloves. "Saw your friend leaving. Ethel worries more than the changing weather. She means well," he said softly, and after a moment, "People are talking." Abby met his gaze. "It's a small town." He gave a single knowing nod. "Small towns remember things the war tried to bury." That night, as Ethan read by the firelight, lost in an old ranching manual, from the shelf Abby quietly sewed a patch onto his worn sleeve. The dogs were a warm bridge between them, curled together in the shared warmth. The silence felt comfortable now, a shared peace, and yet she could not shake the chill that Ethel's visit had left behind. Ethan must have sensed it, for he spoke without looking from his book. "You can tell me to leave whenever you're ready. I won't hold it against you." Abby's head snapped up. "I never said that." "No, but it's in the air. It's all right. I've faced more than just whispers." "I don't care what they say," she answered, her voice stronger than she had expected. "This ranch needed a man who wasn't afraid of work. I needed help, and that is all." He nodded, a brief, unreadable light in his eyes. Perhaps it was respect or a gratitude too deep for words. "Then I will stay, until you say otherwise." As days passed, the whispers intensified. Inside the general store, 2 men were leaning over the worn counter. Spitting brown streams of tobacco, they muttered that the Monroe girl had finally lost her mind. And among them stood Clyde Hardin, Abby's own cousin. He was a stout man, in his early 40s, his face carved by the wind, his restless eyes constantly scanning for an angle. His brother Virgil was a different breed, thinner, sharper, and with a meanness that cut deep. A man with slick dark hair, a prim mustache, and a silver tongue that could twist truth into a lie. They'd craved the Monroe Ranch for years, ever since Abby's father's will had left it solely in her name. But buried within that document was a clause long dormant, all but forgotten, one that would allow the estate to be challenged if Abby were ever deemed unfit to manage it. A simple line of legal jargon, but to a man like Virgil it was a whisper of opportunity. He leaned in close, his voice a low, greasy slick. "You hear the news? She's taken in some soldier. People are talking. Say he's bad news. It wouldn't take much to prove she's in over her head out there. And Cold Springs has laws about that." Clyde's brow furrowed. "Are you sure you want to stir that pot, Virgil?" A thin, cold smile spread across Virgil's face. "The talk's already started. I'm just guiding it." And by the dawn of the next day, an official letter was on its way to the county clerk. Abby was blissfully unaware that a storm was gathering, moving down the very same road her friend's wagon had traveled. Back at the ranch, a fragile peace held, as if the world beyond the ridgeline ceased to exist. Ethan was teaching the dogs to follow a trail, dragging old leather gloves through the deep snow, their scent a lesson in the wild. Abby often found her gaze drawn to them, Shadow ever the disciplined guardian, Scout the fearless heart, and she realized with a quiet ache how much the dogs reflected the people they now called family. Ethan's smiles were rare, but they were true. And his laugh. It sounded like a forgotten language, a man solely remembering the sound of his own life. One evening, as the sky bled a soft pink across the snow-covered land, Abby stood at the fence line and spoke into the stillness. "You could have been long gone by now." He turned to her, his expression a mystery in the fading light. "I could have," he admitted. But running has never brought me any peace." Abby's eyes drifted to the field where the dogs painted joyful patterns in the deep snow. "Then stay," she offered gently, "until you find something that does." A profound silence settled between them after that. The biting cold of their evening closed in, but between the 2 souls standing in the twilight, a different kind of warmth blossomed and held strong. The snow began to fall thick and unhurried, a silent white curtain descending to mute the living world. By midday, everything was rendered in quiet shades of gray, and the Monroe Ranch felt like a lone island of smoke and timber adrift in an ocean of white. Abby stood at the window, her fingertips tracing the patterns of frost on the pane as she watched Ethan in the yard. He was clearing the path again, a familiar, comforting routine. His collar was pulled up high, his breath pluming in the frigid air like engine steam. Shadow and Scout, full of life, weaved between his legs, challenging the shovel with every bite into the snow. They were growing bigger, their coats thick and wild against the biting chill, their tails beating out a rhythm of pure, stubborn joy that not even winter's grip could still. The steady cadence of his work had become her heartbeat, a constant grounding sound that reminded her she was no longer alone. But on this day, a dissonant note was about to break the quiet harmony. Late in the afternoon, the sharp crunch of wagon wheels on snow shattered the silence. A knot of ice formed in Abby's stomach before she even laid eyes on them. 2 horses, 3 men. Virgil and Clyde hard in her own blood, their imposing shapes made larger by heavy winter coats, flanked a stranger who sat stiffly between them. Their horses blew clouds of steam into the biting air as Abby stepped onto the porch to face what was coming. A coat slung over her shoulders, but it offered no warmth against the chill of what was coming. She knew trouble when she saw it long before Virgil swung himself off his horse. He moved with the coiled grace of a predator, a man who mistook his own cruelty for a form of charm. His dark hair slicked back defied the wind and falling snow, and a mustache that curled with the smug certainty of a man who was convinced he was the smartest person in any room. Clyde dismounted next, heavier and more deliberate, his broad frame swallowed by a thick brown sheepskin coat, the brim of his hat already dusted with snow. His gaze darted uncomfortably between his brother and Abby's hardened stare, the look of a man already drowning in regret. The third, a lawyer, by the very cut of his suit, eased himself down from his horse with caution, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with fingers stiff and red from the biting cold. He was a tidy, middle-aged man, his face so pinched and pale it seemed filled with ink and paper instead of blood. His name was Henry Alcott, a clerk from the county seat in Rollins. "Afternoon," Abby Virgil said, peeling off his leather gloves. His smile was a thin, frozen line. "Hate to interrupt such a lovely day, but we have business that just can't wait for the thaw." Abby's voice was steady as a rock. "If it's business, Virgil, it can wait. A storm's rolling in." Virgil let out a low chuckle. "This is the kind of storm I'd ride through twice to see finished." His eyes slid past her toward the house, and his smirk widened into something uglier when he spotted Ethan through the window, his form silhouetted by the stove. "Seems you've got company." Abby stood her ground, unflinching. "You rode all this way just to gossip, Virgil. I thought you left that to the ladies in town." Clyde shifted his weight uneasily, but Virgil paid him no mind, drawing a folded document from the depths of his coat. "Not gossip law." He held it up. "This is Father Monroe's last will. The original, not the copy your lawyer filed when things were settled. According to this document, your right to this land hinges on your ability to properly maintain it," he drawled, letting the words hang in the freezing air. "And if you're deemed unfit or remain unmarried, control reverts to a family trusteeship, which means us." A cold dread filled Abby's stomach. "You can't be serious." Virgil just tapped the paper. The ink doesn't lie. He passed it to Alcott, who took a hesitant step forward, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Monroe, the clause is in fact real, and it is legally binding. Unless it is challenged in court, it stands." Then a voice calm and deep cut through the tension from behind her. "You should leave." The stillness in his voice was forged from steel. Ethan stood in the doorway, snow melting on his broad shoulders, a silent guardian. His presence filled the space behind Abby, a bulwark of quiet warning. Virgil sized him up, the way men measure the fight in each other's eyes. "And you are Ethan Cole," he answered, his voice even. A smirk played on Virgil's lips. "Ah, the soldier." Virgil's tone was laced with insinuation. "Townfolk say you've gotten quite comfortable out here." "Is that right?" Ethan's gaze never faltered. "I fix what's broken. That's all." Virgil's grin stretched sharp and cruel. "Well, if fixing things is what you do, you ought to take a look at this paperwork. It appears the lady needs a man's signature to hold on to her own property. Maybe that's why she has you around." Before Abby could even draw a breath, Ethan took a step forward. "Keep her name out of your mouth." His voice was dangerously low, yet the air crackled with such intensity that even the horses grew restless. For a silent, suspended heartbeat, the only sound was the mournful whisper of the wind. Clyde cleared his throat, a desperate attempt to shatter the tension. "We didn't come here for a fight, and come here for coal, just the law." "Then you've said what you came to say," Ethan replied, his voice final. "Now get off this land before the storm gets any worse." Virgil brushed his coat smooth, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You have 1 week, Abby. We'll return, and either that clause is settled, or the county will hear about it. It'd be a real tragedy to see the Monroe place fall into disrepair." He tipped his hat with a mocking flourish before turning to swing onto his horse. "Enjoy your soldier." And with that, the 3 men spurred their horses away, their tracks cutting deep scars in the pristine field until the snow swallowed them whole. Abby remained frozen on the porch, the document a crumpled mess in her fist, her breath hitched in her throat, each exhale a ghost in the bleak air. Ethan moved to her side, his presence a silent anchor. She could feel the warmth from his coat, a steady grounding force. After a long moment, she whispered, "They can't take this from me. My father entrusted this to me. I've worked this land, paid every tax." "They'll use whatever they can find," Ethan said quietly. "Fairness doesn't matter, only what's in writing." Abby swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I will not let them win." "I know you won't." He gazed out at the wind-scoured fields of snow. "Then we fight with what we have." Over the next few days, the story became the talk of Cold Spring. The widow Monroe, the quiet veteran, the threatened ranch. It was the only story that mattered. The version you heard depended on who you asked the clerk at the general store, or the postman on his route. By the end of the week, half the town was convinced Abby was losing her home, while the other half swore she was about to marry Ethan just to save it. Abby and Ethan offered no defense. The truth was a quieter thing found in the tireless way Ethan worked from before dawn, repairing fences in the biting cold, and the simple gesture of Abby bringing him coffee, no words needed. Their connection deepened, unspoken, yet it was as solid as the earth beneath them. Most nights after the work was done, they'd sit by the fire, the dogs a warm presence at their feet. He'd be cleaning his old rifle, or mending a leather strap as she stitched up worn shirts. It wasn't an empty silence, but a shared peace. Now and then she would look up to find his gaze already on her, steady and unwavering. One evening, the pups scrambled into her lap, and she laughed a sound so unfamiliar it startled her. A small, genuine smile touched Ethan's lips in response, and in that moment a fragile, unnamed emotion passed between them. On the 7th night, the wind howled once more, rattling the house's old bones. Abby stood at the window watching snowflakes melt against the pane. At the table, Ethan was writing in a small, weathered notebook he always kept with him. The dogs were sleeping soundly by the hearth. When he sensed her eyes on him, he gently closed the book. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low. "If this land is what holds you here, you shouldn't lose it to another man's greed." She turned from the window, her heart pounding. "Ethan, what are you saying?" He held her gaze. "There might be a way to beat them. That clause, it was about being unfit or unmarried. If a marriage would satisfy it—" "Ethan," she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to do this." "I'm not saying it because I have to," he replied. "I'm saying it because I want to." In the heartbeat that followed, the world seemed to stop. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft stirring of the dogs as the snow tapped gently on the glass. Abby searched his face, looking past the quiet strength she'd come to rely on, past the sorrow that always lingered in his eyes, and found not a trace of pity. There was only raw, unflinching sincerity. She didn't have to speak. Her answer was in her eyes as they met his. And in that shared silence an understanding was forged, something more binding than any vow. He gave a single, slow nod, as if he'd heard her silent consent, and turned back to the fire. A promise now hung in the air between them. It wasn't a promise spoken, but a warmth that bridged the cold space between them, settling like the first light of a new day. A quiet hope waiting just past the frost. The morning of the hearing arrived brittle and gray, with a cold that burrowed deep into your bones and your memories. Intricate patterns of frost webbed across the window panes, and each footstep on the porch echoed with the sharp crack of shattering glass. By the stove, Abby Monroe stood armored in her best dress, a simple dark wool meticulously pressed the night before, and she fastened the final clasp with hands that betrayed none of the tremor in her heart. Her hair, usually worn in a loose tie, was now gathered in the tight, resolute bun at the nape of her neck. The reflection staring back from the basin mirror seemed years older. The harsh winter light etched every line of worry on her face, yet her eyes held something more, a deep stillness, an unwavering resolve, the quiet power of a soul who had stopped fleeing from fear and had finally turned to face it. Ethan Cole was waiting outside. He wore a clean flannel shirt and the familiar brown coat from the night their paths first crossed. He'd shaved that morning, the blade leaving his jaw a little raw, but the sharpness seemed to suit the man he was becoming, stripping away the look of a wanderer, revealing a man making a stand. His boots gleamed with polish, but the leather held scars that no shine could ever erase. His gaze met hers as she stepped onto the porch, and in the silence a world of understanding passed between them. The pups, Shadow and Scout, observed from the doorway, their tails wagging with a hopeful energy that defied the day's oppressive weight. Ethan finally spoke. "You ready?" he asked softly. Abby gave a single firm nod. "As I'll ever be." They hitched the wagon riding into Cold Spring just as the sun feebly pierced the clouds, casting a pale, shimmering light on the snow. The town was already stirring. Word of the trial had spread faster than any morning mail. Townsfolk huddled on the street, their whispers following the wagon like a cold shadow, their faces obscured by scarves and shrouded in suspicion. A few offered nods of silent solidarity. Most simply turned their backs. Cold Spring was a town that always preferred a good story to the hard truth. The courthouse was a stark brick building, squat and square against the horizon. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust ink and aged wood polish. Judge Samuel Carter presided from the bench, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and a face carved by years on the open plains. Carter had a reputation for being fair, but he had no tolerance for foolishness. His pale, sharp eyes swept across the courtroom, assessing both sides of the room. At one table, Virgil and Clyde Harden sat dressed as if piety were woven from starch and black wool. Between them, Henry Alcott fussed with his papers, his slender fingers skittering over the pages like agitated spiders. On the other side, Abby stood shoulder to shoulder with Ethan, her chin held high in silent defiance. Behind them, a sparse crowd occupied the benches. Ethel Sanderson was among them, wrapped tightly in her green scarf, her lips a thin, determined line, as if she could hold her breath and bend fate to her will. The bailiff's voice boomed, calling for order, and the proceedings commenced. Henry Alcott was the first to rise, his voice as dry as parchment. "Your Honor, we are here today to address the matter of the Monroe estate, and specifically a clause within Mr. Monroe's original will, which stipulates that continued ownership is contingent upon the heir demonstrating competent stewardship, or else be subject to a family trusteeship." He motioned toward Abby with a practiced courtesy that was far more insulting than any open disrespect. "It is our contention that Miss Monroe has failed to meet this requirement, and therefore the property must, by right, revert to the Harden family, Virgil leaned back, a smug smirk betraying a victory he already claimed. Abby's pulse thundered in her ears, but when she spoke, her voice was unwavering. "Your Honor, for 3 winters I've run that ranch by myself. The ledgers are here." She laid the well-worn ledgers on the table, the ink a steady testament, every number, an act of pure defiance. Feed purchased. Livestock tallied, taxes paid. You will find no debt, no sign of neglect. Judge Carter began turning the pages, his brow creased in concentration. "Seems to be in order," he murmured. "What evidence proves otherwise, Mr. Alcott?" The lawyer faltered. "Only that the land has been used for purposes beyond its original intent." "And what purpose is that?" He cleared his throat. "Sheltering unrelated persons without a contract, specifically a man who is living on the premises." Ethan felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom fall upon him, the air growing thick and tight. He stood up slowly, his presence commanding the space between words. "That man would be me, Your Honor," he stated, his voice steady. "My name is Ethan Cole. I am a former Navy SEAL. I arrived here during the storm that nearly claimed my life and the lives of 2 others. He glanced toward Shadow and Scout, sleeping peacefully in a basket by the bench, unaware of the heavy moment. I stayed because there was work that had to be done. The fences were collapsing. The barn roof was almost gone, and she..." He paused, his gaze finding Abby's. She was doing the work of 3 men alone. "I didn't stay out of charity. I stayed because it was a place worth saving." Virgil scoffed. "A touching speech, soldier. But you mending barns doesn't make her fit to be a landowner." Ethan held his stare. "No, but it proves she's not alone in keeping it alive, which is more than can be said for men who only tear down what others build." The judge raised a hand. "That will be enough." He studied Ethan for a long, considered moment. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "You served, yes, sir, 15 years. Then you understand discipline. You know the truth isn't always what's written down on paper." Carter turned back to Abby. "Miss Monroe, is this man in your employ?" "No, Your Honor," Abby replied. "He works alongside me. There is a difference." A soft murmur swept through the courtroom. Ethel gently dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Clyde shifted uncomfortably, but Virgil just leaned forward, his voice cutting like ice. "So you admit it? He resides there without an agreement, working without pay. That's irregular to say the least, unlawful at worst." Abby's resolve never faltered. "What's unlawful about simple kindness?" Virgil laughed. "Call it whatever you want, Abby. Everyone in this town knows what it is." Ethan's hand clenched into a fist, but Abby gently touched his arm, a small, calming gesture that spoke volumes more than rage. She turned to face the judge again. "This land is everything I have. My parents built this place from nothing. My father always said, as long as someone still cares for the soil, it belongs to them. I care for it, Your Honor. Every single day. Through drought, through storms, through all the gossip. You have seen the records. You have heard about the work. That is everything I can give." The entire room fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath at the window. Judge Carter leaned back, his hands steepled beneath his chin. After a long, heavy silence, he said softly, "You've given more than enough." He brought the gavel down with a single, sharp crack. "The court finds Miss Monroe to be the competent and lawful owner of the Monroe Ranch. The clause has been satisfied. Case dismissed." The verdict landed like the first crack of ice in a long winter. Abby released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethel's soft applause was lost in her quiet tears. Clyde sagged a man defeated, while Virgil's grin twisted into something truly venomous, the cold rage of a man who'd just lost his grip. He snatched his papers, his eyes fixed on nothing and no one. His boots hammered a grim retreat down the hall. Ethan faced Abby, his voice low. "It's over." She slowly looked up at him, her gaze shimmering with a fragile mix of relief and disbelief. "For now," she breathed. "But I think we won more than just a lawsuit." Outside, snowflakes drifted down from a pale blue sky. The air smelled of pine and the biting cold of metal. But for once, the chill didn't seem to bite. Ethan stood beside her on the courthouse steps, his hand brushing against hers, not by chance but with a quiet purpose. She didn't pull away. For the first time since her father passed, Abby Monroe felt like she owned not just the land, but her own destiny. And Ethan Cole, the soldier lost without a platoon, realized that somewhere between mending fences and the fire's glow, he'd found a reason to make a stand once more. That courthouse victory came home with them like the first fragile thaw of spring. And for a handful of precious days, the Monroe Ranch was filled with a quiet that felt like peace. The snowpack began to soften around the fence posts. The sun found the courage to linger, and the sound of hammers and the dogs barking finally replaced the hushed whispers. Ethan worked to mend what the storm had broken. Abby fell back into her routine, while the pups Shadow and Scout grew eager with the promise of spring. But even peace can be hunted. Some ghosts don't sleep through the winter. And it began the way all trouble does. At first, slowly, the wind just turning sharp and wrong. The evening was calm, the sky bleeding into a bruised dusk. Abby was cleaning up from supper, the warm smell of cornbread and coffee mingling with the smoke, while Ethan carefully oiled his rifle by the fire. Every movement was precise, deliberate. This wasn't paranoia born of fear. It was discipline, pure and simple, the kind ingrained in a man trained to anticipate the worst. He'd learned to hear what others couldn't, to feel the very rhythm of the night, to the sounds that didn't belong. And tonight something was wrong. He stood head-cocked, his entire body suddenly rigid and still. "Hear that?" he asked. Abby stopped her spoon mid-air. "Just the wind," she replied. He shook his head. "Engines." A moment later, the sound sharpened into a low rumble that sliced through the cold. Then 3 pairs of headlights appeared crawling slowly over the ridge, their beams fractured in the snow and fog. Old trucks plodding heavy and unhurried, the kind carrying men who never hurry unless it's to make someone else permanently late. Abby's blood ran cold. Ethan quietly set the rifle next to the door, his jaw tight. He recognized the sound in a way she never could. When the trucks stopped just outside the gate, the wind brought their voices male and coarse, too loud for just talk. The slam of truck doors followed. Then, a flash of red scarves tied around necks and arms, a vivid stain against the darkness. The color hit him like a specter from a forgotten war. Red scarves, the mark of a small mercenary unit he knew from overseas. Men who sold out their own brothers for a payday. Ethan's throat constricted. He had buried that memory years ago in desert sand and silence. One of them, a man named Lucas Grant, was the one who sold them out, who left him to bleed out in the dust and fire. Seeing those red scarves was like the past clawing its way from the grave. Abby rushed to his side. "Who are they?" "People who don't belong here," Ethan answered, his voice a low growl. His hand tightened around the rifle. "Stay inside. Lock the back door." "I am not leaving you," she vowed. For a fleeting moment his eyes met hers, the soldier's mask cracking just enough to reveal a primal fear not for himself, but for her. "Then get behind me." The men drew closer, their boots crunching on the frozen earth. There were 4 of them, their faces weathered and cruel. One, a tower of a man with a crooked nose, wore a long leather coat that swept the snow. Marcus Vane, a name tied to smuggling and a kind of brutal violence that never needed a reason. His dark hair, streaked with gray, touched his collar, and a scar cut across his cheek like a lightning strike. He was the kind of man whose smile meant ruin was near. The others were smaller, coiled with meanness, their faces gaunt and hollow, carrying the stench of whiskey and cold steel. Vane raised a hand. "Evening, Monroe," he said, the politeness, a chilling facade. His voice was a slow, deep rumble steeped in tobacco. "We heard you got a war hero staying with you. Navy man, right? Thought we'd drop by, show our respects." His grin stretched wide, showing a missing tooth. "See, our friend Ethan owes us a debt from his past, and we've come to collect." Abby's knuckles whitened on the doorframe. "You've made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice firm. "There is nothing for you here. Vane's eyes drifted toward her, lazy and filled with malice. There's always something. Lady, isn't that right, Cole? Ethan stepped fully onto the porch, the rifle now ready. You boys rode a long way for nothing. Turn your truck around and keep going. Vane let out a laugh, a harsh sound that rolled across the snow like a death rattle. Oh, we're just here for a conversation. Maybe take a look around your place. Maybe light a fire or two. To keep warm. That last word was a command. One of the men by the truck threw something, a bottle with a flaming rag stuffed in its neck, arcing through the night like a malevolent star. It shattered against the barn, and a wall of fire roared to life in an instant. The old dry timber caught immediately, a raging orange tempest. The puppies shrieked from inside, their frantic cries cutting through the chaos as Abby screamed their names and bolted. But Ethan snatched her wrist. No! He yelled. You'll burn! Then we go together. She shot back, her eyes blazing with defiance. And before he could hold her, she ripped her arm free and charged into the choking smoke. Ethan swore and plunged in right behind her. Inside the barn, the heat slammed into them like a physical blow. The air was thick with blinding smoke, the ground a crackling bed of fire. He found the puppies huddled in terror by the trough, whimpering. Abby was already with them, coughing desperately, wrapping them in a blanket. Flames scaled the walls like living creatures. Ethan grabbed a bucket, dousing a path to the door, his lungs on fire. They stumbled out into the frigid air, just as the massive roof began to splinter and collapse. The fire cast monstrous shadows across the snow, painting the entire homestead in the colors of hell. Vane's men moved in dark silhouettes framed against the inferno. Ethan dropped the bucket and raised his rifle, his voice a blade in the wind. Leave now, or I will put you down. Vane just sneered, still the soldier thinking you can save what's already ashes. He pulled a pistol from beneath his coat. The only one left to save is yourself. The next few seconds became a silent, instinctive ballet of violence. Ethan fired first, the rifle's crack, splitting the night. One of the men dropped. The others scattered for cover, their own shots ringing out as Abby dove behind the trough, clutching the pups, the air around her, singing with the hiss of bullets and the roar of consuming flames. Ethan moved with the ghost of his past, swift, precise, his body remembering every drill, every kill. He rolled, fired, and vanished. A figure lunged from his flank, and Ethan met him halfway, the stock of his rifle smashing into bone. The man crumpled, groaning into the snow, as Vane fired twice more, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face in hideous bursts. Then, a shout echoed from the road. Sheriff Thorne's voice, deep and commanding, "Drop your weapons." Beams of red and blue pierced the smoke as the sheriff and two deputies charged forward, rifles at the ready. Thorne was a formidable man, in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with a thick beard, his badge catching the flickering firelight. His piercing gray eyes missed nothing. He'd weathered enough winters to know that justice often arrives after the damage is done. His deputies fanned out the fight, dissolving in the harsh glare of their flashlights as the attackers reluctantly dropped their weapons, hands raised, curses spilling into the cold air. Thorne's gaze swept from Ethan to Abby, then to the smoldering barn. "Hell of a night," he muttered before snapping orders to his deputies. The great flames were finally dying down, leaving only black smoke to curl into the gray dawn. Ethan stood breathing heavy, the rifle limp in his hands. Abby moved to his side, soot streaking her face, her hair wild, the pups still trembling against her. He looked at her, at this woman who had run into the fire without hesitation, and something deep inside him shifted an unspoken, absolute recognition. As the true dawn broke, the snow was stained pink and gray with ash. The barn was a ruin, but the rest of the ranch had survived. The sheriff shoved the captured men into his truck, vowing to sort everything out in town. Vane's stare burned through the bars of the rear window, a silent promise of vengeance yet to come. Ethan turned toward the house, his voice low. "You should have stayed inside." Abby met his gaze. "And let you fight that alone?" He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You're stubborn." "You knew that when you stayed," she answered softly. They stood there, the smoke drifting east with the wind, the pups pressed between them, their breath fogging the morning air. The fire was finally out, but in its place a different flame burned quietly, something neither would ever walk away from again. The fire had long been extinguished, but its ghost remained in the lingering scent of ash and charred timber. Days passed, the snow slowly melting, revealing the blackened earth where the barn once stood. The cold still held its bite, though the sun was beginning to find its courage, spilling pale gold across the frozen landscape. Life, cautious yet persistent, was slowly returning to the Monroe Ranch. Abby stood in the yard at dawn, wrapped in a worn wool coat, her breath a white plume in the lingering chill. Beside her, Shadow and Scout raced through the melting snow, their coats now thick, their paws flinging mud where frost once lay. They were no longer the trembling puppies she had held that fiery night months ago. Now they were young dogs, brimming with strength and purpose, one steady and watchful, the other reckless and brilliant. When they barked, their calls echoed across the open plains, chasing away the crushing silence that had owned this place for too many winters. Ethan was already hard at work. Near the charred foundation sleeves rolled a hammer firm in his hand. His beard had grown back in, dark, now flecked with silver, a quiet testament to the months they had weathered. The harsh lines around his eyes had eased since the night of that terrible fire, but a shadow in his gaze still held the weight of a man who'd seen too much ruin. Yet when he looked at Abby, a genuine warmth now shone through, where before only stern discipline resided. He was rebuilding more than the barn, he was mending something silent between them, a bond stronger than the very wood they nailed and the walls they were raising. Sheriff Thorne's truck became a familiar morning sight, his patrol truck crunching over the melting slush in the yard. The man was as solid as the land he served, broad in the shoulder, his brown coat perpetually dusted with snow. His thick gray beard made him look as if he were carved from the very mountains he patrolled. While it was the law that had first brought him out after the blaze, duty had slowly given way to friendship. He'd check on their progress bringing supplies from town. A new coil of wire, a bag of nails, even a sack of feed for the dogs once. Good folks shouldn't have to rebuild alone, was his simple reason. But his eyes held the deep understanding of a man who knew that some scars aren't seen. He stood beside them that morning, watching Ethan drive another nail. "Town's still buzzing," Thorne said. "Only now the talk is different. The folks around here, they see how you fought for this land. They see how you stayed put. It reminds them what true decency looks like." Abby offered a faint smile. "This cold spring is reminding people of decency. That's new." Thorne let out a low, gravelly chuckle. "Miracles arrive in small packages, Miss Monroe. Sometimes it's 2 loyal dogs and 1 good soldier." By mid-morning, the smell of fresh-cut lumber began to erase the scent of soot. Ethan had raised the first wall by hand, the boards laid straight and sure. Abby handed him nails. Her gloves covered in sawdust, her cheeks flushed from the cold air and exertion. Every once in a while, their fingers would brush, and neither of them pretended not to feel it. The rhythm of their work was steady. A hammer, breath, heartbeat, the sound of living once more. Later that week, the sheriff returned with a deputy report in hand. "Vane and his crew won't be seeing daylight for a long, long time," Thorne stated. "Assault, arson, criminal trespass. You name it, the judge threw the book at them." He then looked to Ethan. "Your name's in this report. Ex-military honorable discharge. Word is you'll get the commendation for your actions." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't do it for any commendation." Thorne gave a nod. "I know you didn't. But the record will reflect the kind of man you are." He tipped his hat to Abby before turning back to the truck. "You two take care. This winter's losing, but it still has a bite." With the lengthening days, the snow receded, and a shy green returned to the fields. Ethan began to till the soil. His movements were patient and measured, while Abby planted seeds in neat, careful rows. The dogs followed them closely, chasing crows and shadows, their energy a living reminder that after ruin, life insists on starting over. The air smelled of damp earth and surrounding pine. When the wind moved across the plains, it no longer carried a lonely howl, but the quiet, constant hum of renewal. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of gold, Abby sat on the porch, holding a coffee cup, watching the fading light spill across the new barn. The pups were lying at her feet, fast asleep, their coats catching the day's final golden warmth. Ethan came to her side, wiping grease from his hands, the day's labor settling not as weight, but as peace. He sat beside her, letting the silence stretch between them, a language they now shared fluently. It was honest, effortless, and shared. At last his voice broke the quiet. "When I first got here, I never thought I'd last. I didn't think I had it in me." Abby turned her gaze to him, his features sculpted by the amber glow of twilight. "What made you stay?" He searched for a moment, the words struggling to surface. "The noise. It finally stopped," he said. "All the things I used to hear in the dark, the echoes, the ghosts, they just faded. I think this place, this life, it reminds you how to hear the quiet again." A lump formed in Abby's throat. "I know exactly what you mean," she whispered. "I always thought being alone meant I was safe, but it was just a different kind of empty." They remained there as the sky bled into violet, watching as the first stars pricked the darkness and awoke. Shadow raised his head, his ears alert, while Scout rolled over with a contented sigh. A small smile touched Abby's lips as she stroked their backs. "They've gotten so big," she murmured. Ethan nodded slowly. They had to. Spring arrived in gentle, measured breaths, the snow finally conceding to the greening earth. The fences once again stood tall and proud, and the Monroe Ranch began to breathe again, humming with the steady rhythm of life reclaimed. Folks from Cold Spring started stopping by to trade or just to help. The same men and women who once gossiped in whispers now spoke with warmth, offering eggs or feed or the simple gift of their time. Ethel Sanderson visited too, that familiar green scarf around her neck and a fresh jar of honey in her hands. Her eyes took in the mended barn, and the two people before it, a knowing smile etching deeper lines into her face. "I told you," she said, her voice warm. "Miracles have a way of showing up when you stop looking for them." Abby laughed and hugged her. "You were right." "I'm not sure I'd call it a miracle," Abby mused. "Maybe just a second chance." Ethel's eyes twinkled with wisdom. "My dear, a second chance is just a miracle that earned its keep." By the time the wildflowers bloomed, Ethan had raised a new corral, shored up the roof, and planted a line of saplings by the drive. The dogs kept a proud watch, their barks echoing like a solemn vow. In the evenings, Abby and Ethan sat before the hearth, sometimes sharing stories, sometimes simply lost in the crackle and dance of the flames, listening to the wind's low whisper and the steady breathing of the two souls who embodied everything they had fought to save. One morning, as the last traces of frost vanished from the porch railing, Ethan found himself outside in the pre-dawn stillness. Dawn was breaking, painting the horizon in strokes of rose and silver. Abby joined him, pulling her shawl close against the crisp air, rich with the smell of pine and thawing earth. He turned to face her, his gaze clear and unwavering. "I'm not leaving, Abby," he said, his voice low but certain. This is home now." Her own gaze softened a true, heartfelt smile, finally gracing her lips. "It always was." And with her words, the sun crested the mountains, spilling liquid gold across the plains. The snow was gone, leaving behind dark, fertile soil, hungry for new life. Shadow and Scout tore across the yard, their joyful barks aimed at the vast, open sky, the sound of their freedom filling the entire valley. Ethan watched them, his hand finding Abby's. He had journeyed through fire flood and a crushing silence to find his way to this moment. and here at last was the one thing no war or wilderness could offer him a place to belong. The light grew stronger, the wind carrying the promise of a new season. And in the heart of it all, Abby and Ethan stood together, breathing in the clean, open air of their future, the symphony of life resonating around them as the memory of winter softened into a tender echo. In the end, the story of Abby, Ethan, Shadow, and Scout is about more than just a ranch saved from the flames or land defended from greed. It is about how grace finds us in the most silent places, how miracles are not claps of thunder, but small mercies woven into the fabric of our days. Sometimes a higher power doesn't speak in words, but in the warmth that comes back after a long, cold winter, in a stranger's steady hand, in the loyal breath of two dogs who remind us that love can indeed rise from the ashes. May this story show you that faith is not confined to church walls, but is for the moments you choose compassion over fear, for when you keep standing even as the wind howls its loudest. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who may need a light in their personal storm. Leave your thoughts in a comment below. Subscribe for more stories of hope and new beginnings. And may God bless you and yours with profound peace, unshakable strength, and the quiet miracles waiting for you in your own life.